It's almost impossible sometimes to truly wrap your head around immense human suffering. Those huge numbers, they can feel so distant.
Yeah, they really can. Just abstract figures.
But today, let's try to focus on a crisis that really demands our attention. One that often gets, lost in the news cycle despite its staggering scale. Yemen.
Mm-hmm. Definitely overshadowed.
We're talking about a conflict where the direct death toll is estimated somewhere between, 13,000 and 80,000 people.
At least. And that's just direct combat deaths.
Exactly. But the indirect impact, the famine, the disease, the displacement, that number is just exponentially higher. Over 16 million people lack reliable access to food and clean water.
And the cholera outbreaks? Over 1 million cases. It's unbelievable.
It really is. And this whole catastrophe has been worsened by a long-standing Saudi-led blockade.
A huge factor, yeah.
So our mission in this deep dive is to understand the fundamental causes, the intricate web of factors that have created this ongoing tragedy.
And what's truly striking is how the current crisis is just so deeply rooted in Yemen's history. It wasn't always a single entity,
Right. Tell us about that separation.
Well, you had North Yemen, the Arab Republic. It had a leaning towards Islamic nationalism.
Okay.
Then there was South Yemen, the People's Democratic Republic, which was this fascinating but ultimately pretty unsuccessful Marxist experiment.
Backed by the Soviets, wasn't it?
Exactly. Under British rule until '68, then heavily Soviet-backed. Economic aid, naval power. Aden was seen as critical for their Indian Ocean foothold.
So for decades, these two Yemens had completely opposing ideologies.
Total hostility, really.
How did they eventually come together then?
Well, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990 left South Yemen incredibly vulnerable economically, politically.
So the support dried up.
Completely. Unification under the North president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, became almost like a necessity for survival for the South.
But it wasn't a true merging of equals, I take it.
Not really. As our sources highlight, think of it as more transactional than transformational.
Like a corporate merger out of necessity.
Kind of, yeah. Two very different cultures, different goals forced together. And those underlying ideological and cultural rifts, they never truly healed.
Setting the stage for later instability.
Absolutely. Laid the groundwork.
Okay, let's unpack this further because the first Gulf War in 1991 seems like a really critical turning point in this whole story.
Oh, absolutely. Huge. President Saleh's decision to support Saddam Hussein had massive, long-lasting consequences.
Especially with Saudi Arabia.
Right. Retaliation was swift. They expelled over 800,000 Yemeni workers.
Wow, 800,000. The economic impact must have been devastating.
Immense. Those remittances were a lifeline for so many families, and they just dried up overnight.
And other aid stopped, too.
Yeah, Western and Gulf aid disappeared as well. This economic downturn, the social unrest that followed, it really poured fuel on those smoldering Southern separatist feelings.
So those existing divisions just got way worse because of the war's fallout.
Precisely. Significantly exacerbated.
And that directly led to the 1994 attempt by the South to actually secede.
Exactly. Ali Salim al-Baid, who was the Southern leader and vice president then, launched a campaign to restore South Yemen's independence.
But Saleh's forces stopped them.
They did. Saleh's forces, and interestingly, this included the then defense minister, Mansour Hadi, who becomes important, later defeated the secessionists.
So Yemen stayed unified, technically.
On paper, yes. But it really solidified northern power and bred this deep resentment in the South, this feeling of, northern hegemony.
Fueling more resistance down the line.
Constantly. And Yemen's isolation after '91 really pushed it towards internal breakdown. It created these vulnerabilities, these vacuums.
Which non-state actors were ready to exploit.
Exactly. Which brings us to the emergence of these terror networks. It's unsettling how these power vacuums become breeding grounds.
How did al-Qaeda gain such a foothold?
Well, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, really started making its presence felt in the early 2000s. The USS Cole bombing in 2000 was a huge wake-up call.
Right, I remember that.
They thrived in those remote tribal areas, places the central government had little control over. They were smart, exploiting local grievances, making alliances with tribes.
And they weren't just focused locally.
No, definitely not. They had international ambitions. The 2009 underwear bomber plot, that was AQAP, they got bolder after the Arab Spring, even capturing territory.
And then ISIS showed up, too.
Yeah, ISIS entered the scene later, carving out their own areas, recruiting. And the clashes between AQAP and ISIS were, and still are, incredibly brutal. Assassinations, turf wars.
Just adding another layer of violence.
A very dangerous layer. And both groups were really skilled at manipulating the narrative.
How so?
They consistently framed foreign interventions, whether Western or later Iranian influence via the Houthis, as imperialism or sectarian attacks. They positioned themselves as the defenders.
Tapping into existing anger and frustration.
Precisely. The weak central government essentially turned parts of Yemen into a safe haven for jihadist factions with global reach.
This volatile mix. Ungoverned spaces, extremists. It seems like the perfect precursor to the Arab Spring protests in Yemen.
It really was fertile ground. Then the Arab Spring hits in 2010, 2011, and that feels like another major turning point.
What happened then?
You had mass protests erupting against poverty, against corruption, the lack of democracy, things that had been simmering for years.
And this put huge pressure on President Saleh.
Immense pressure. He'd been ruling for 3 decades. And you saw existing tensions flare up, too.
Like with the Houthis.
Exactly. The Zaidi Shia Houthis up in the north, who had actually been in rebellion since 2004, really stepped up their opposition.
And the southern separatists.
They saw an opportunity, too, reviving their cause.
So Saleh was squeezed from multiple sides.
Completely. After months of unrest, protests, even an assassination attempt on him.
He finally agreed to step down.
He did, yeah. Under a GCC initiative, that's the Gulf Cooperation Council. His deputy, Mansour Hadi, took over in a transitional arrangement.
Backed by the Saudis and the U.S.
That's right, they supported the transition.
But Saleh didn't just fade away, did he? This is where it gets really wild.
Not at all. He officially stepped down, but he kept a lot of influence behind the scenes, retained loyalties within the military, for instance.
And then the alliance with the Houthis.
That was the truly shocking reversal. He allied himself with his former enemies, the Houthis, specifically to try and unseat Hadi.
Wow. So much for the transition.
Exactly. It completely blew up the political landscape. Any initial hopes for democratic change just got crushed by these power struggles and increasingly foreign interference.
Pushing Yemen into even deeper conflict.
Much deeper.
Okay, let's focus on the Houthis themselves for a bit. They didn't start as a purely military group, right?
That's right. Back in the 1990s, they began as more of a Zaidi Shiite cultural revivalist movement in the north. Zaidi Shiism is a distinct branch of Shia Islam, quite prominent in Yemen.
So cultural and religious roots. How did they become such a powerful military force?
Over time, they felt increasingly marginalized, politically, economically sidelined, and faced what they saw as religious discrimination. This fueled their transformation into a militant insurgency.
And the post-Arab Spring chaos was their opportunity.
It absolutely was. They capitalized on the power vacuum, the weakness of the transitional government, rapidly expanding their influence.
Culminating in taking Sana'a.
Yes, by 2014, they'd seized the capital, Sana'a, and forced President Hadi to flee.
And the role of Iran here seems absolutely critical.
Oh, it's pivotal. The Houthis have received really significant support from Iran, particularly from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
What kind of support?
Weapons, training, funding, often smuggled in via maritime routes. For Iran, Yemen became a key theater in its regional rivalry with Saudi Arabia.
A proxy battleground.
Essentially, yes. And this Iranian backing enabled the Houthis to develop some pretty concerning capabilities.
Like missiles and drones.
Exactly. Ballistic missiles, drones,
Yep.
which they've then used to launch attacks against Saudi Arabia itself.
And their alliance with Saleh. You mentioned that ended badly for him.
It did. It initially helped them consolidate power, but when Saleh tried to switch sides again in 2017, looking for a deal with the Saudis, the Houthis assassinated him.
Wow. So that cemented the Houthis' position, but also maybe isolated them further.
It certainly solidified their role as a key Iranian proxy in that broader regional Shia-Sunni conflict.
Which leads us directly to 2015 and the intervention of the Saudi-led coalition. What triggered that massive step?
Primarily, it was the rapid advance of the Houthis towards the south and the very real fear in Riyadh of having an Iranian-backed group controlling large parts of Yemen right on Saudi Arabia's southern border.
So Hadi fleeing was the final straw.
Pretty much. Saudi Arabia quickly formed a coalition. The UAE, Egypt, Sudan, others were involved and launched Operation Decisive Storm.
With the stated goal of restoring Hadi's government.
That was the stated aim, yes. To push back the Houthis and reinstate Hadi.
And their main strategy was air power.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Heavy reliance on airstrikes, extensive bombing campaigns targeting Houthi-held areas.
But that bombing had a horrific impact on civilians, didn't it?
Tragically, yes. While the coalition claimed to be hitting military targets, there's just overwhelming evidence that civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, markets, homes were frequently hit.
leading to accusations of war crimes.
Widespread accusations, yes. And what's critical to understand here is the enabling role played by Western powers.
How so?
The U.S., the U.K., France, they provided crucial support to the coalition. We're talking arms sales, intelligence sharing, aerial refueling for the bombers, maintenance support for the aircraft and vehicles.
So Western weapons were being used in these strikes.
Absolutely. Advanced weaponry, American F-15s, British Typhoons, French helicopters, U.S. tanks, European warships, air defense systems, largely supplied by Western nations, were deployed by coalition members like Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
And this continued despite the civilian casualties.
It did. Despite the horrific civilian toll, despite international condemnation, arms sales largely continued. You might remember President Trump vetoing congressional efforts to block sales, prioritizing a huge deal with Saudi Arabia.
It highlights that really uncomfortable paradox, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Powerful democracies fueling a war with such devastating consequences.
It's a deeply troubling aspect of the conflict.
Now, the UAE's involvement. You mentioned they were part of the coalition, but their goals weren't exactly the same as the Saudis, were they?
That's a really key point. While they joined the coalition, the UAE increasingly pursued its own distinct agenda in Yemen.
What drove that difference?
Well, they grew disillusioned with President Hadi, seeing him as ineffective, and they were particularly wary of Islamist factions within Yemen, especially Isla, which has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood.
So they backed a different group.
They did. They threw their support behind the Southern Transitional Council, the STC.
That's the separatist group, aiming for an independent South Yemen again.
Exactly. The STC, with UAE backing, seized control of Aden and other parts of the southern coast in 2017. This effectively sidelined Hadi's forces in the south and really fractured the anti-Houthi front.
So the coalition fighting the Houthis was also fighting itself, in a way.
In many ways, yes. Competing agendas within the coalition itself.
And the UAE also used mercenaries, didn't they?
They did, quite extensively. Private military contractors, PMCs, hundreds of them, mostly from Latin American countries like Colombia, El Salvador, Panama, Mexico.
Trained by who?
Many reportedly had prior training from U.S. military personnel or contractors linked to figures like Eric Prince of Blackwater fame.
Operating under UAE contracts.
Yes, hired by the UAE, often operating from secret training facilities. It allowed the UAE to project power while minimizing casualties among its own national forces.
A privatization of war, essentially.
That's a good way to put it. And the UAE's backing of the STC definitely deepened Yemen's fragmentation.
Meanwhile, Russia seems to be playing a longer game, re-emerging on the scene.
Absolutely. Russia's been strategically reasserting itself, and Yemen is part of that. They're drawing on those old Cold War ties with the former South Yemen.
How are they doing that?
Well, inviting the STC president, Adaris al-Zubaydi, to Moscow back in 2018 was a very public signal. Recognition, potential alliance building.
And reopening a consulate in Aden.
Exactly. That shows a clear intent for growing engagement with the southern authorities, separate from the internationally recognized government.
What's Russia's strategic interest there?
Multiple things. Reviving historical influence, certainly. But also, Yemen sits on that crucial maritime choke point. Access or influence there, perhaps on Socotra Island near the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, is strategically valuable.
Part of a bigger regional play.
Seems like it. It fits with their broader strategy partnerships with the UAE elsewhere, counterbalancing Turkey and Qatar. As the U.S. and its allies face backlash for their role in Yemen, Russia sees an opening to position itself as an alternative power broker.
And amidst all this state-level maneuvering and proxy fighting, the threat from groups like AQAP and ISIS, it hasn't gone away.
Far from it. AQAP is still very active, especially in central and southern Yemen. They continue to exploit local grievances, the lack of governance. They remain a dangerous branch of al-Qaeda, plotting attacks both inside Yemen and potentially internationally.
Still a global threat, then.
Definitely. And ISIS, though maybe not as embedded as AQAP, has carried out incredibly brutal attacks targeting civilians, Houthis, even AQAP itself.
So they're fighting each other, too.
Oh, yeah. There's an intense and violent rivalry between AQAP and ISIS. Ideological differences, clashes over territory and recruits, it just adds another layer of chaos and instability.
Makes any peace process even harder.
Absolutely. Any lasting peace deal has to figure out how to address this persistent threat of terrorism because these groups thrive in the conditions of a failed state, porous borders, weak authorities, readily available weapons.
Yemen's geography itself is just so critical, too. Let's talk about the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. Why is it so important?
It's one of the world's most vital maritime choke points. This narrow waterway between Yemen on one side and Djibouti and Eritrea on the other. It connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea.
And tons of oil passes through there.
Millions of barrels every single day, over 6 million barrels daily. It's absolutely crucial for global trade, energy security, and military logistics, too.
Like the Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly that level of importance. A tiny bottleneck with huge global significance. If it gets disrupted, the global economy feels it immediately.
So it's always been strategically valuable.
For centuries, yes. A focus of imperial ambition, and now a key contested zone in these modern Middle East proxy wars.
And the Houthis have actively targeted shipping there.
They have, yes. With Iranian backing, they've used sea mines, drone boats, anti-ship missiles to attack commercial vessels and coalition warships. It's a direct threat to global commerce.
Which explains the increased naval presence.
Precisely. You've got the U.S., France, China, they all have bases nearby in Djibouti, deploying more naval assets to protect shipping lanes.
And the UAE's actions on Yemeni islands.
Yeah, their occupation of islands like Perim, right in the Strait, and Socotra further out. That's clearly about reinforcing their maritime strategic posture in this critical area.
And Russia's interest in Socotra fits into this too.
Absolutely. It's likely linked to challenging Western naval dominance in this key waterway. Instability in Yemen automatically means instability, or the threat of it, at the Bab al-Mandeb. It's a global flashpoint.
And now, adding another layer, we're seeing the Houthis drawing Israel into their rhetoric and maybe even actions. That feels like a significant escalation.
It really does. They've broadened their rhetoric beyond just Saudi Arabia and the UAE to include Israel. It potentially widens the entire conflict.
Especially after the Abraham Accords.
Yes. Following those normalization deals between Israel and some Gulf states, the Houthis really ramped up the anti-Zionist framing, declaring solidarity with the Palestinians.
And they claim to have weapons that can reach Israel.
They make those claims, yes. Developing long-range ballistic missiles and drones. Most of these claims are unverified, but the stated intent is there.
And Iran's influence is likely behind this shift.
It seems very likely, yes. Iran's strategy appears to involve creating this ring of fire or encirclement around Israel using proxies like Hezbollah and Lebanon, militias in Syria, and now potentially the Houthis in Yemen.
So Israeli defense circles must be taking this seriously.
They are. They view Yemen as a potential launch pad for asymmetric attacks. It's led to increased intelligence sharing between Israel, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, ironically.
So while maybe a direct Houthi-Israel war isn't likely right now.
The rhetoric, the potential capabilities, it suggests Yemen is becoming increasingly tied into Iran's broader regional strategy, which definitely heightens the risk of a much wider conflict breaking out.
Through all of this, the geopolitics, the proxy wars, the strategic choke points, it's just vital. We don't lose sight of the absolutely catastrophic human cost on the ground in Yemen.
It's easy to do, but we can't. That's perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire deep dive.
Just remind us of the scale.
Over 24 million Yemenis, that's like 80%, the vast majority of the population, needing humanitarian assistance just to survive.
And the children.
Alarmingly high rates of child starvation, over 2 million children suffering from acute malnutrition, recurring cholera epidemics that have swept through the population.
And the healthcare system.
It's completely collapsed, further strained by COVID-19, of course. Hospitals are in ruins, medical staff often haven't been paid in years, they lack basic supplies.
Education must be devastated too.
Totally. Schools destroyed or repurposed for military use, a whole generation is being deprived of education.
Basic necessities like water and food.
Lack of clean water is chronic. Food prices have skyrocketed due to the blockades, the fighting, inflation. It's created unimaginable suffering.
Women and children being especially vulnerable.
Always the case in conflict, isn't it? Displacement, violence, increased risk of trafficking.
And aid organizations face huge challenges getting help in.
Immense obstacles. Airstrikes, hitting aid facilities, blockades preventing supplies from getting in, general insecurity, bureaucratic hurdles.
The UN calls it the worst humanitarian crisis of our time.
They do, and yet aid remains consistently underfunded and inconsistently delivered.
Civilians just caught in the middle.
Completely caught between all these warring factions, bombed by airstrikes, extorted or taxed by local militias, displaced multiple times. Their suffering often feels like, well, like a footnote in international diplomacy.
And hope for peace just seems to fade.
With every passing day of conflict, it diminishes, the suffering deepens. It's just staggering, the scale of it behind all the politics.
And bringing us right up to the present, mid-April 2025. The situation is still incredibly tense, isn't it?
Extremely volatile, yes. The Houthi campaign has actually escalated recently, partly linked to the ongoing Gaza conflict.
How so?
They've been firing more ballistic missiles and drones, not just at Red Sea shipping, but increasingly targeting Israeli territory itself.
Reaching Israel.
There have been recent reports of missiles fired towards cities like Ashdod, even near Ben Gurion Airport. One was intercepted, apparently, but it shows an expanding reach, which is deeply concerning.
And this is still with Iranian support.
Oh, definitely. Continued. Strong support from Iran. Weapons, training, advanced communications tech. It's helping the Houthis consolidate their control over western Yemen, including Sana'a and the crucial Hodeidah coastline.
And reports of Iranian advisors building a surveillance state.
Yes, those reports are disturbing. Using things like fuel revenues from controlled ports and taxing maritime traffic to fund their operations and tighten control.
How is the U.S. responding?
Under President Trump, the U.S. has intensified its air campaigns against Houthi infrastructure. There was a strike just recently, April 17th, on the Ras Issa fuel terminal, reportedly causing significant casualties.
And Saudi Arabia's stance.
They've been maintaining a more cautious public stance since the 2022 ceasefire largely held, providing overflight rights, logistical support to the U.S. perhaps, but not direct ground engagement like before.
What about the UAE? Are they involved in potential offensives?
It's complicated. There have been reports of coordination between the UAE and U.S. military planners regarding potential land operations against the Houthis. However, the UAE has publicly denied any involvement in such plans.
Highlighting those competing strategies again.
Exactly. It really underscores the complex, sometimes contradictory agendas among the Gulf partners involved in Yemen.
So let's try and bring this all together. We've journeyed through Yemen's fractured history, haven't we?
We have those deep roots of division.
We've seen how it became this devastating stage for proxy wars, mainly Iran versus Saudi Arabia and its allies, including the U.S.
Classic example, tragically.
We've looked at the rise and the interplay of dangerous terror groups like AQAP and ISIS, thriving in the chaos.
Exploiting every vacuum.
We've touched on the absolutely critical strategic importance of the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, why the world watches Yemen's coast so closely.
A global economic artery.
And throughout, we've tried to keep focus on the utterly devastating human cost of it all.
The most important part, really.
It truly feels like a conflict with no clear battlefield, no obvious path to victory for anyone, and certainly no coherent peace strategy in sight.
And what's fascinating in a grim way is how all these threads are so tightly interwoven. The history feeds the present, the regional rivalries fuel the local fighting, the strategic geography raises the stakes, and the terror groups exploit the fallout.
It creates this incredibly complex, tangled, tragic knot.
Exactly. And ordinary Yemenis are the ones caught in the middle, bearing the brunt of forces largely beyond their control.
Which really leads us to our final thought for you, the listener. Given this intricate web, the history, the international meddling, the terrorism, the strategic importance, and above all, the sheer scale of human suffering, what are the realistic pathways towards any kind of sustainable peace in Yemen?
It's the hardest question, isn't it?
It really is. And what role can, or maybe should, external actors play in trying to achieve that peace without just adding more fuel to the fire, without making things even more complex and tragic?
Because without some kind of urgent, concerted international mediation effort, it feels like the suffering is only going to get deeper.
A deeply sobering thought to end on.